Thank you, Ted, for letting us come to your studio today. It's a pleasure. Can you please tell us a little bit about your background with regard to art and how you got involved in being a professional artist?
Thank you. Well, first of all, Bex and Alka, glad you're here. I think coming to the studio is actually quite a good idea. It lets you see the background where the actual painter is working. Coming back to where did I start and how did I start, I was raised in a background of post-war Glasgow, and I sensed very early on I was coming out of school, there would be no tertiary education, that quite bluntly the money would be needed in the family from what I could earn. I got lucky in the context that as I was doing that, there was a job that I found out about coming available with a large Glasgow publisher in their artist room. Absolutely no connection with the printing trade, but with the folder of art I showed and my academic record, I got that job out of I think 29 or 36 boys, which was no small achievement. That immediately opened me into the artist room in the publisher, which had several very talented artists who could not make a living in post-war Glasgow at that time. Difficult enough today, but and doubly so coming out of that war. And it offered me opportunities in design training that I just would never have been aware of or been able to enjoy. So that built the foundation for design and awareness of colour, and from literally, I walked out of school before I was 15, wouldn't be able to do that today, but since I've been 15 I've been paid to push a brush. In fact, it's quite interesting, halfway through that apprenticeship on the 3rd year anniversary, it was a 5-year apprenticeship, I had handed my mother the wage packet and I heard her whispering away in the corner with my father, who was a very highly skilled carpenter. And in my year 3, as I was leaving the 2nd year moving to the 3rd year, I was actually earning more than my father. So I think the printers and the artists in that sense had it right and the poor old carpenters had it wrong. And just again to give another sense of the time, I was in that artist room nearly 2 years before I was allowed to address the journeyman by their Christian name. So I went and stood beside Mr. Miller. It was about 18 months later I was allowed to call him Bob. So it's a whole different think tank today, but it certainly gave me a training in the fist and calligraphy and elements and drawing that you just don't get, I don't think, today. My father, from his carpentry, he worked as a maintenance. He was sent out and he worked full time, funnily enough, for another publisher, quite a coincidence, but he brought me off-cut cartridge paper 2 or 3 nights a week, a wee pile of it from the guillotines, so there was always a constant supply of paper, which is actually very important. You just don't stop drawing, so not good. And from that it developed. Always been able to make money at this, always been able to make money. In those days, in my own time, maybe the odd watercolour type thing or the odd pastel, but it would be more money from designing lemonade labels and things, not just quite as easy to do as it sounds. So yeah, always been involved in the graphic arts and studying, and that's where we are there.
You predominantly work in watercolour. What is it about watercolour that you're drawn to?
Yeah, I'm definitely a watercolour freak, there's no doubt about that. I have worked in oils, quite like pastels, like drawing with soft pencils, but I like the immediacy of watercolour. I don't believe the truism, if you like, or the false opinion that the weekend painter has of it, that it's terribly difficult. It's the most difficult of the mediums. Now, what I will say about watercolour is it's different, and it does not suffer fools happily. I'm painting in transparent watercolour, so if it's a white, it's the paper, which means, in my case, I'm painting around quite complicated integrated white shapes. Now that beats a lot of people. It definitely does. But beyond that, it's just another medium with its own demands. No more, no less difficult than, say, oils. Possibly less difficult than oils, I don't know. It probably demands quick-fire brain attention more than oils. You have really got to be moving when you're moving, when a watercolour's going down and you're taking advantage, especially the wet-into-wet painting, where you're either pre-damping the surface or you've just painted into the surface, and while that is drying back, I'm watching the viscosity of it, I'm watching if the surface is glistening. Am I going to paint into that with syrup or with tea? What am I mixing into it? Because I am mixing the paint there and then on the paper. That came from the German expressionists. The English came up with this as a method of painting. The Americans took to it like a duck to water and produced, I think, more exciting colours, watercolours than the English lads did. But the explosive wet into wet technique that if we paint watercolour most of us use, I think we're coming back to the expressionists for that, and that is an extremely exciting thing to have on board. The painting is actually happening before you, so you've got to learn to work with the watercolour, give and take all the time.
How do you think that element of speed in watercolour painting affects your interpretation of an image?
What I'm after, and this comes back to, I studied on an ongoing basis from New Zealand. I've regularly flew up to California, that's a long bus trip, and studied with the American master Rex Brandt. Learned a hell of a lot from him. He took me under his wing and learned very quickly. You make the watercolour fit the subject matter, assuming it's not a non-abstract, but you're actually painting some subject, and you make the subject fit the watercolour. In other words, it's content and form fitting each other. That's the Cézanne. That's what he was after. He more often than not got that. Occasionally got that and he didn't like that, and I'm settled for that, trying to get the bowl of flowers or whatever it is to take the watercolour form, and and incidentally we're also painting some water lilies. It's got to give the impression of water lilies to the viewer. The paint's working quite quick. That puts a limit on you. You're trying to keep an awareness of white paper. That definitely is behind you all the time. And I'm trying to paint saturate colour where it calls for saturate colour. And ideally, with mixing wet into wet on top of that, try and not go into it for too many more bites at the cherry. Now that can be extremely technically quite difficult, demanding to do. I'm looking for the white shapes in the paper. I'm looking to link the whites. They've got to jump and tend to go together. They're higgledy-piggledy. I've got a friend who studied with me for quite some time, and I borrow her phrase, I like my garden higgledy-piggledy, and I like my watercolours higgledy-piggledy, not completely set. They've got to move and stir and go round in their own way for themselves and still be what you're trying to do. So I'm looking for a soft, probably third to half value, soft-edged underpainting, which can easily be overpowered because there is an edge hierarchy. The eye sees a hard edge before it sees a rough edge, before it sees a soft edge. So the soft brushed wet into wet underpainting, which anticipates where we're going, very quickly becomes overpowered, if you wish, or you've got to watch that you get that right, by the harder edges that come in as the painting starts to dry. And you are painting into that with those secondary shapes pretty strong colour. You've got to keep the form open and not completely close it off to let the eye get round the painting, and try and not go in for too many overpainting strokes so that the colour is allowed to glow from beneath, and the paper comes glowing from beneath, and that's what gives, depending on the cool warm that you paint into it, that's what gives the watercolour its luminous effect. It's a lovely medium, it's a very exciting medium to paint into.